So you've decided that you want to start game mastering a tabletop role-playing game. Perhaps you have already been a player, or perhaps you've even game mastered before, but not for a long time. Today we're going to talk about what I think you should consider if you're getting into tabletop role-playing. Hi everyone, I'm Garrett, and like I said, today we are going to talk about what should you consider if you are getting into tabletop role-playing games. I have the pleasure, and I do think it's a real pleasure and privilege, to run games several times a year for people who have never played a game before. But if you're like me, you probably started experiencing role-playing games when you were much younger. I've been game mastering now for nearly 20 years, and regularly for nearly 20 years. And increasingly, I kind of start to forget that there was a time when I didn't do this as much as I did now and hadn't done it as much as I do now. And if I was getting into this hobby in 2025, what would I want to know? What would be like the most useful and concrete information for someone who is getting into game mastering now? Because I'm sure if you're like me, you get asked this question quite a lot. Like, I'd like to do this, but what do I need to do to get into tabletop role-playing? Or what do I need to do to get into dungeon mastering or game mastering? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So the format, obviously, for tabletop role-playing games is not really like anything else out there. It's not like a video game. And I always really struggle to explain to people when they ask, what is D&D or what is role-playing and what is role-playing games? And you kind of end up finding a halfway house by kind of saying it's kind of like a video game, but not quite. It's kind of like a board game, but not quite. You have one player who is not called the player, who kind of runs the game, and everyone else are the players, and you call them players. And it can be a little bit confusing. But say you're sat there now and you're thinking, I'd really like to get into this, or I have, you have game mastered before and would like to get back into it. Let's just go through some things that I think that everyone should consider. Now, these tips aren't in any particular order. They're just things that I believe you should consider if you want to run a successful role-playing game. So it's worth saying straight away that obviously we talk about campaigns quite a lot, and a campaign is effectively a series of linked adventures. So a series of linked scenarios, and it'll be how you set these up and how you run them that we're going to be talking about today. So number one, you don't have to play D&D. So Dungeons and Dragons is overwhelmingly the most popular tabletop role-playing game out there. And sometimes people want to play D&D because they want to play D&D. That's what they've signed up to do. And there's a kind of cultural value, I suppose, a bit of cultural capital involved in saying that you understand what D&D is and you are a D&D player. And to some extent, obviously, with the 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons being so successful, which first came out in 2014, many people gravitate towards this. I think sometimes people say, you shouldn't play D&D, you should go and play other games out there. The problem with that is that there is a lot of resources for D&D, of all kind of like types of D&D. Many times, I've had lots of success running different games for people as their first game. In particular, I find that a lot of people, there's a certain kind of person, quite a lot of people, who probably the first time you run a game for them, if you run something like Call of Cthulhu, something set in the real world, but with fantastic or supernatural elements, they find that much more appealing. But whatever you choose, you should choose something that you want to run. It doesn't matter if it's Pathfinder or D&D or Call of Cthulhu or Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay or a Traveller or Mjölkborg. Any of those games are good and they're well written, but you should really want to run them. So that's probably the first consideration that you have to make. And then secondly, I would just consider who you're running the game for. So it might be, if you're like me, you kind of just made some friends and you're going to kind of subject them to this type of game that you like. And it is worth saying that you don't want the group to be too big. I really want to emphasize this to you. I've run games for groups of about 14 before, and that was using old school essentials, and that really kind of was very effortful and involved on my part. That was during the pandemic. But for the most part, I would prefer to run smaller character, smaller player groups, because the thing is that every single time you add another person to the group, it kind of quadratically adds to the amount of time it takes to get through a scene or an encounter, especially combat. It takes much longer to get through combat with 6 players than it does with 3 players. So I would have a limit in your head of, I want to run a game of D&D. I want there to be 4 players, because then we can kind of cover like the generic, like specific, like traditional roles. But then having the strength of character in yourself to say to other people if they want to join, no, can you just, I don't want to run a game for much larger people, much larger people, a much larger group, because it's going to involve more table management. It's going to involve more prep. It's going to involve me knowing more about a different number of characters, and then the adjudication of the game is also going to go slower. It's just how it works. The other thing worth saying about considering the player group and making it smaller is, or making sure that you only have the number of players that you want, is obviously we are going to have that whole old kind of bane of all game masters almost immediately, which is scheduling conflicts, right? We need everyone to agree when we're going to meet up and actually play. And the more people you add, well, then the more kind of difficult it's going to be to get everyone around the table. And this doesn't sound so bad at first. I think that it's a bit of a kind of gingerbread house in the sense that you're like, okay, no, I'll just run it for loads of people and we'll just find a time we can all play. I promise you it will not work. If you have 8-10 players, you will not be able to get them all around the table every single week. Maybe that's okay. Maybe you're going to play what's called a West Matches campaign, or you're going to just play a more sandbox campaign where people don't have to be there every session. But if you want to play the traditional kind of zero to hero, epic Lord of the Rings style story, which a lot of people are playing D&D for, I would really limit the number of players that you have around the table, if anything, just to reduce the amount of scheduling conflicts that are definitely going to emerge like from the first session. And then next, I really want to emphasize the value of this. I think you should read what other people have written. Read adventures, read fiction, obviously. Like if you want to run a fantasy game, you should read fantasy fiction. I once did a video about what I consider to be required game master reading for D&D game masters. If you click in the top right now, you can see it. It's a very old video of mine. But in terms of adventures, you should read what other people have written, because people have been doing this for a long time now, right? People have been writing adventures for tabletop role-playing and for D&D for like 50 years now. And for other games, like maybe slightly less, but for a long time, like longer than I've been alive. And obviously, there are many things that people have written that are not very good. But there's also obviously examples of kind of prime examples of adventure design where you read, you go, oh, wow, that is really cool, interesting. And I would love to kind of see my friends try and deal with the hazards that this particular adventure deals with. I wouldn't just read it. I would actually run something that's been pre-published as your first adventure. I think that's really important because it gives you a sense of what the expectations from an adventure should be, depending on who wrote it. I've written a couple of adventures myself. There's the free one, the Barrow of Balagrim. There's a link to that below. That's a really good example of a short opening dungeon. I think that if you are running D&D, that first adventure should be a dungeon. And the reason it should be a dungeon is this. It really limits the options that the players have. And what I mean by that is if you say to them, okay, I'm going to run a mystery for you. I'm going to run a really social heavy game. Maybe you're going to run Rough Night of the Three Feathers for Woothrup, which is this kind of like farce in an inn that takes place over the course of an evening. It's really difficult for the game master to work out where the decision points for the players are going to be. But if you run a dungeon for them as your first adventure, you know, they pick up some clues and then it sends them off in the direction of Cragmore Hideout or, I don't know, White Plume Mountain or like I said before, the Barrow of Balagrim, that's mine below. It just means that the decisions become, okay, we're in a dungeon. Do we want to go left or do we want to go right? And maybe you can ask for some perception checks or listen tests to see if there's anything happening down either kind of corridor. But it limits that and makes it more manageable for you as the game master. I think that sometimes new game masters get so excited about creating things. And because that's one of the real enjoyments of the hobby, they get so excited about creating things that to some extent they forget that other people have been doing this a lot longer than them. And I include myself in that. Like I understand that there are people who have been game mastering and are more experienced and better at this than I am. And some of those people also write adventures kind of commercially. And maybe I should read what they've written, because even if you don't end up running an adventure that you've read, you're quite likely to find something, maybe an NPC or just a room in a dungeon that you find really compelling and interesting, and you end up dropping into your game regardless. Now, the next tip is important, and this is the one that frustrates me the most about new game masters in terms of when people ask for advice and then they kind of don't listen to what you've said, because it's really important. You don't prep anything that you're not going to use. And it's because the pleasure in game mastering is, or often, not always, but for me, and I imagine for many of you out there, the pleasure is in creating worlds, settings, characters, histories, all those kind of like large, grand details. But ultimately, if it's not going to come up, then there's no point in doing it. If it's never going to exist in the game world, there's no point in creating it. If no one's ever going to be able to learn about it, there's no point creating it. And the thing about this is that it becomes entirely wasteful. And I've read posts before. I've even had new game masters say to me, I don't really feel like I can get around to playing the game because I've got so much prep to do. I've got to, I've got to do all this kind of like preloading of the game. Don't do that. That's where you read an adventure that somebody else has written and run that for the first time, and then you can start to add details of your world. The temptation always with setting building for new game masters is to start with the big and zoom in on the small. Like start with the whole, like the history of the universe and the gods and the planet, and then zoom in on where the action is going to take place, zoom in on the adventure, and everything. I would say intuitively kind of like puts you in that mindset. The big, is before the small. But actually, what you should be doing as a game master, and this is the most practical tip I'm going to give, is you really should start with the small thing, right? Start with what the adventure is going to be, and then work out the details from there. That's not putting the cart before the horse. That's putting kind of like what's going to be on screen onto the set, and then everything that is not going to be on screen, you can kind of work out between your sessions. You can work on it later. And what you'll also find as well is if you do this, if you start with the adventure and in terms of prep, if you start with the adventure and work towards the big ideas in your prep, you'll find that the players contribute things to the ideas of the setting that you're creating and that you can just steal that are really, really, really kind of like cool and interesting and things that you wouldn't have considered. And then lastly, I just say, don't be too hard on yourself. I think a lot of game masters see game mastering as a very anxious process and they kind of avoid doing it. And many people who will be good at game mastering just end up being like kind of forever players because they're too kind of worried about getting it wrong. All I would say about this is that just know the rules of the game that you're running and know the details of the adventure that you're running. All the stuff like setting details can come later. And what will happen is this will give you a sense of confidence at the gaming table. But remember, you are not just a referee and an arbiter of the rules. You are an interpreter of the rules and an interpreter of the setting and an interpreter of the narrative. And ultimately, what you say goes. And I find in knowing that, I'm never anxious because if someone says, well, that's not how that rule was, say, okay, that it might not be, but we're just going to use it like this. And then I'll look it up at the end of the session. And 99% of the time, players just pass you a beer and just go along for the ride with you. Because ultimately, everyone wants to have a really good time. Now, they're my top 5 tips for new game masters. I'm sure there's many more that we could have talked about. Drop a comment below and let me know. But otherwise, like, subscribe, do all that good stuff. I'm Gary. Thank you for listening, and I'll speak with you again soon.